So in the first class, we looked at what is called the first pillar of the United Nations, peace and security, and we discussed how the Korean Peninsula issues for the last 70 years have been dealt with in the United Nations in the context of the UN's efforts to fulfill its primary purpose, which is maintaining peace and preventing a war. In this second class, we would like to move on to the next pillar of the United Nations, which is human rights. As we saw in the previous discussion, as we discussed in the first class, the importance of human rights as well as development reflects the lessons learned from the two world wars in the 20th century. Lessons we learned that without giving people better life, without giving people human dignity, it is very difficult to maintain peace. Because when people are not happy, they will become desperate. They will try to change society no matter what. What is the typical example of people who dare to change society when they don't have that kind of power? They are very weak, but they want to challenge society and change society. And they become extremely desperate. What they do? They become terrorists. They kill themselves along with a lot of people around them and try to send message to society. They cannot change society, but they are so desperate that they believe that that's the least they can do to change society. What they are doing is totally wrong. Nobody should resort to terrorism in sending their messages. But at the same time, to prevent terrorism, what is important is that we shouldn't make people feel like that. We shouldn't make people feel like, no, I cannot live in this society anymore. I have to change this society no matter what. It doesn't matter if I die. Usually people don't feel like that. For humans, life is very important. Life is extremely important. So we shouldn't make people feel like that. It might be their fault to feel like that, but we should also think about why some people come to think like that. So that's one of the important issues and one important rationale for the United Nations from the beginning. You can maintain peace only when you give people better life and human dignity. Why do human rights matter? What are human rights? Human rights is a relatively new concept. The concept came into being only in early modern period, like 400, 500 years ago. It has a lot to do with the philosophical movement called Enlightenment, and also it has a lot to do with democratic process studied in Europe. And the concept of human rights lay at the core of the American and French revolutions, both in the 18th century, which inaugurated an era of democratic revolution throughout the 19th century, paving the way for the advent of universal suffrage. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was adopted in 1948, so 3 years after the creation of the United Nations, is Article 1 says this very famous sentence, which in my opinion sums up everything about human rights. This short sentence: all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. To you, this might sound a little like cliche, but if you had said this to someone 200 years ago, anywhere in the world, they would not agree with you. How come all human beings are born equal in dignity and rights? If you are born to a king, you are a prince or princess. If you are born to a slave, you are also a slave. Then who makes you equal? You don't have an answer actually. If you were time traveling 200 years back, if you meet someone and you tell them, do you know that all human beings are equal, born equal in dignity and rights? And then they will say, you are crazy, who said that? Then what do you say? Well, I heard from Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you cannot say that because it's only 1948. If they ask you, who said that? Is it in the Bible? Confucius said that? Who said that? You can say, oh, I say that. But this is new concept. And actually, it was not realized until 200 or 100 years ago in many parts of the world. All human beings are born equal? No, they were not born equal. They were born differently, with different status. Then why do we say that? Say this. Why is it fundamental principle of human rights? Because we want to make society like this. In my first class, I told you about a set of ideas on how this society should be like, this society should be run. And we call them what? An ideology, right? An ideology is a set of ideas about how this society should be like, how this society should be run. So, in my opinion, human rights is also an ideology. We made this concept because if we have assumption like this, we think this society would be better. If we assume that all humans are born free and equal in dignity and rights, then we think this society, we would live in a better society. So human rights, in a way, is also an ideology. Human rights is a social concept. What does the social concept mean? This concept exists only in society, in relations between humans. If you are Robinson Crusoe living in a desert island by yourself, your human rights are totally protected. Who's going to violate your human rights? if a lion on that island tries to eat you, is lion violating your human rights? Lion has to eat also. And you are legitimate food. So nobody is violating your human rights. But if you have someone else, let's call him Friday, and he came up to the island, this desert island as well. Now you are two, and you tell Friday that, okay, from now on you do all the cooking. I will do the dishes. Then, is there any human rights violation here? Or just division of work? What do you think? What if Friday feels that, how come I always cook and he only does dishes, Is it fair? There is an issue of human rights, right? So, issue of human rights arises when there is more than one person. That's why human rights is a social concept. Human rights violations can occur anywhere: at home, domestic violence; at work, sexual harassment; at school, bullying. But most serious human rights violations are all committed by whom? By states, by governments. Why? Because states are the most powerful institution humans have ever created. States can put people in jail. States can execute people. States can control people if they do not abide by what state would like them to do. Your parents cannot do that. Your schools cannot do that. Your churches cannot do that. Only your state can do that. State can put you in jail. State can kill you. Who gave states that kind of power? In democratic society, people. But you might say, no, I didn't give states power to kill. But you might not, but majority of people in your country did. How about if you want to change that power? You can, through elections, through voting, through amendment of constitution, through new legislation. You can ban, prohibit capital punishment. Then states cannot kill. Right? Anyway, states are the most powerful institutions humans ever created. And states are the most serious potential violators of human rights. Just think about Holocaust, in which Nazi Germany killed 6 million Jews just because they are Jewish. Think about killing field, in which Khmer Rouge government in Cambodia killed 1.5 million people. Because they didn't want to use their bullet. Bullets are expensive. They used plastic bags to suffocate people. Very typical examples of states violating human rights. In the United Nations, as we discussed, human rights is one of the 3 pillars, and I already explained to you how the other 2 pillars, human rights and development, are extremely important for the first pillar, peace and security. In fact, without human rights and development, it is very difficult to maintain peace because people who are hungry, people who do not have human dignity will become desperate and will try to change society no matter what. If you have critical masses of these desperate people, your society is very unstable. Unstable society leads to conflicts, war, terrorism, killing. In 1948, 3 years after the creation of the United Nations, they adopted Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You know, the United Nations realized that one of the first things they should get around to is an agreement on basic principles of human rights. And the Economic and Social Council, ECOSOC, I was once president of ECOSOC in the UN. ECOSOC in 1946 established first two subsidiary bodies. One of them is a Commission on Human Rights, and the other one was Commission on the Status of Women. So these two issues they thought were very important at that time. And Commission on Human Rights, its first task was to negotiate an international document on human rights. This commission was headed by Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt, who was a widow of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. But this commission worked hard, but they realized that it was very difficult to reach consensus on an international treaty. You know, international treaty signed by countries are binding on countries. So countries are very careful in agreeing on international treaty. So if there is so diverse views on human rights, so if you try to have an international treaty on human rights, the content will be very, very limited. So they realized that instead of having that kind of limited international document, they better have very comprehensive, ideal document and make it not binding, not a treaty, but a declaration. Declaration is just political, so you declare your views. So this document is not binding, not obligatory. So that's how the Universal Declaration of Human Rights came into being in 1948. And some 20 years later, the United Nations were able to produce treaties, two treaties actually, and they called them covenants. Covenant on political and civil rights, covenant on economic, social, and cultural rights. So these two covenants, these two treaties, and 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, these three documents are sometimes called International Bill of Rights. You know, you heard about Bill of Rights in America or UK. So that concept is applied here. So these three documents put together are sometimes called International Bill of Rights. And in the UN, they have machinery, mechanisms for human rights, and General Assembly and ECOSOC deal with human rights. But more specifically, they established Human Rights Council in Geneva, which is devoted to dealing with human rights. And also in Geneva, they have High Commissioner for Human Rights, who is Under Secretary General level UN official who has the responsibility of dealing with all human rights related issues. Human Rights Council was actually created in 2006, which replaced the Commission on Human Rights. I earlier told you that Commission on Human Rights was created in 1946 as one of the first subsidiary bodies of UN ECOSOC and was headed by Eleanor Roosevelt and which produced Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But that same Commission on Human Rights mostly operated in Geneva after that, and they dealt with human rights issues. But by 2000, a lot of people realized that Commission on Human Rights is not enough for dealing with all these human rights related issues in the world. So they created Human Rights Council in 2006 to replace the Commission. This is Human Rights Council in Geneva. They have a very unique, beautiful ceiling. According to Freedom House, an NGO, human rights situation in the world is like that. It's like this, there are 45% of countries in the world which are free. There are 30% which are partly free. There are 25% which are not free. This represents quite an improvement from what it used to be like, let's say, 40 years ago. I think 40 years ago, even if you put free and partly free, they accounted for less than half of all the countries in the world. So you can say that democracy spreads. If you just consider the countries in Asia, 30 years ago, was South Korea democratic? Was the Philippines democratic? Was Indonesia democratic? So you can see the changes, But even today, according to Freedom House, there are countries with the worst human rights record. And according to Freedom House, this is not my opinion, the worst is Syria, South Sudan, Eritrea, North Korea, Turkmenistan, Equatorial Guinea, Saudi Arabia, Somalia, Uzbekistan, Sudan, Central African Republic, and Libya. But these status of these countries are not fixed. They change every year, in my opinion. Not my opinion. Everyone believes that. I know one of these countries is changing rapidly after the passing away of its leader a few years back. The country is liberalizing very fast. So the way I see it, probably that country will get out of this list very soon. So the reason why they are doing this, this is kind of naming and shaming approach, is to encourage these countries to change, to improve their human rights situation. Nobody is actually perfect in human rights. So some countries have a little better human rights situation than others. So it's just like development assistance. Nobody is perfectly rich. Some country is a little richer than other countries. So if you are richer than others, you help other countries who are poorer than you are. Because we want to achieve a world where we enjoy prosperity together. If one country lives very well, and in some other countries people are starving to death, you cannot be prosperous by yourself. It's not going to work like that. In those countries, people will become refugees, people will escape, people will revolt, people will do everything to change society. So you help them if you are richer than them. Human rights is the same thing. If you have a better human rights situation than others, you help others. But in human rights, there is one problem with that, because even though some countries might acknowledge that their economy is not in a very good shape, their economy is in a worse status than some others, countries might admit that. So they might be willing to accept development assistance. But in many cases, countries don't like to accept that their human rights situation is bad. Why not? Because human rights have a lot to do with democracy. Democracy, ruled by people. Even if you have democracy, it does not mean that all your human rights issues are resolved. Both South Korea and United States stand around 22, 23 in terms of democratic index ranking by the magazine Economist. So neither United States nor South Korea are top 20 countries in terms of democratic index. When it comes to universal periodic review by Human Rights Council, which means all countries in the world get their peer review by other countries on their human rights situation, countries get recommendations by other countries. Recommendations mean, other countries point out something for you to improve, right? In the last 10 years, most countries in the world got 2 rounds of UPRs. And do you know which countries got the most number of recommendations through the 2 rounds of UPR? United States. United States got about 680 recommendations. North Korea got about 400 recommendations. South Korea got about a little over 200 recommendations. But number does not necessarily mean that they have serious human rights problems. The recommendations we got and the United States got include, for example, capital punishment. Why do you still have capital punishment? You get rid of it. Police brutality. Your police is too brutal in cracking down on people. This kind of recommendation, we got it. United States got it. United States got it very often. For example, we got recommendation like, why do you punish people who are gay in your army? Punish them criminally. So we get this kind of recommendation. But North Korea gets recommendation like, why do you have public execution of people? Why do you run political prisoners camp? You send people there without even proper judiciary, procedure. Why do you torture people? So this kind of allegations, this kind of recommendations are way more serious than why is your police use too much force in cracking down on people, right? So that's why North Korea is one of probably about 10 countries whose human rights situation is subject to UN resolution every year, and United States and South Korea are not. So getting a number of recommendations in UPR does not necessarily mean that your human rights situation is worse, but what does it show? It shows that nobody is perfect when it comes to human rights. Just like nobody is totally rich, and rich countries help poor countries. Countries with better human rights situation help countries with worse human rights situation. But the problem is that the government whose human rights record is bad is usually not willing to accept it and willing to accept assistance from other countries. That's the problem. What can the international community do to respond to human rights violations beyond naming and shaming? Naming and shaming, adopting human rights resolutions is naming and shaming. Why is it naming and shaming? Because, as I explained to you earlier, only the Security Council can make decisions binding on countries with respect to peace and security issues. Human rights is one of the three pillars of the United Nations, but it is not dealt with in the Security Council. It is dealt with only in General Assembly, Human Rights Council. General Assembly and Human Rights Council do not have power to take action binding states. If they are not binding states, what are they? They are recommendations. Then, is naming, shaming everything that the international community can do about it? Not actually. Especially recently, there are at least 3 new concepts or institutions that go beyond the naming and shaming. Let's first see at Article 2.7 of UN Charter, which is often called the non-intervention principle. Nothing contained in the present charter shall authorize the United Nations to intervene in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state, or shall require the members to submit such matters to settlement under the present charter. But this principle shall not prejudice the application of enforcement measures under Chapter 7. I hope you understand what it means, but if you don't, what it means is, the United Nations cannot intervene in domestic matters of member states. Basically, that's what it says. The only exception is Chapter 7 enforcement, which I already explained to you. Only the Security Council has power to take action that is binding on states. If it's binding on states, of course it intervenes in domestic affairs. So Security Council action doesn't matter if it's domestic or not, Security Council can impose sanctions. What is sanctions? Security Council can dictate countries not to trade with certain country, which is happening with North Korea. So if you think about it, it's a great interference in domestic affairs. With whom we are going to trade is our decision. But Security Council can tell you, you are a sovereign state, but you cannot trade with this country. This is definitely interference in domestic affairs. But UN Charter says that UN cannot intervene in domestic affairs with only one exception, which is Security Council. But this also does mean that when it comes to human rights, then you cannot intervene, right? That's why what the UN is doing is naming and shaming. You cannot intervene in domestic affairs of a member state. Violating human rights, even if in some country a dictator is killing a lot of people without going to the court, that's not fair, that's human rights violation, but it's none of your business because it's domestic affairs. The United Nations can condemn it. The United Nations can cry foul. The United Nations can try to shame them, but that's about it. It sounds a little unfair, doesn't it? You know, in some country, people are dying because there is dictatorship. Then what you are saying is that United Nations can say, cry foul and call it shame. That's all. Well, that was war in the beginning. But now things are changing. For example, there is what is called International Criminal Court that was established in 2002 in The Hague, Netherlands. And this court is different from ICJ, which is, ICJ, International Court of Justice, which was created with the United Nations. This is new creation. And this court can deal with cases or situations where criminal activities, crimes have been committed by states, government, or high-ranking officials in the government. And they can charge them, this court charge them for 4 serious kinds of crimes. Crime of genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, the crime of aggression. Well, actually, the crime of aggression still needs definition, so it's not yet fully applied. But the 3 crimes above are applied. And there are a lot of leaders, even including some former heads of state, who have been charged and prosecuted and tried at the International Criminal Court and convicted, and who are now in the jail in The Hague. If you ask where is the jail, it's in The Hague. And so this is a new change, isn't it? So if you violate human rights, if you are a political leader, you are a dictator, and you violate human rights of your own people, in the past, it's basically domestic affairs. So UN is not going to intervene in it. UN only intervene in peace and security issues, not in human rights issues. But now, you might be charged at the International Criminal Court. You might be sentenced for life, even if you are a former head of state. There are such cases already. So it's a change, isn't it? In terms of accountability, and in terms of the efforts go beyond naming and shaming. There is another new concept which is called responsibility to protect. Responsibility to protect is a concept that was accepted by the United Nations in 2005. when there was World Summit in commemoration of the 60th anniversary of the United Nations. I was there. I was one of the people who participated in the negotiation of this outcome document. And I was one of the people who insisted that we should include this concept, responsibility to protect, in the document. Because negotiation was very long and very comprehensive. Many argued that, responsibility to protect is very hard to agree on. So let's just do it next time, This time let's just do the other things. But I was one of the group of people who insisted that, no, we should do this time. Otherwise, we will not agree on other parts of the document as well. So why did we think R2P is so important? Because it's also a new concept. R2P refers to obligation of states towards their populations and towards all populations at risk of genocide or other mass atrocity crimes. So R2P is also about 4 crimes. So every state has a responsibility to protect. It's not like international community has a responsibility. It's state has responsibility to protect from 4 mass crimes like genocide, war crimes, crime against humanity, and ethnic cleansing. It's similar to ICC, International Criminal Court jurisdiction, except the last one, ethnic cleansing. So usually, state has that responsibility, but what if, for whatever reason, states cannot exercise that kind of responsibility? The wider international community has the responsibility to encourage and assist individual states in meeting that responsibility. But what is important is number 3. If a state is manifestly failing to protect its population, the international community must be prepared to take appropriate collective action in a timely and decisive manner and in accordance with the UN Charter. So what number 3 means, to protect their people is a responsibility of a state, but if a state fails to do that, fails to protect its population, then the international community will do. Isn't it what used to be called intervention? Yeah, it is. But now we have rationale, legal ground for intervention. Now, non-intervention principle in Chapter 2 of the UN Charter is changing, is being undermined because there are other ways of intervening in what used to be domestic affairs. Protecting your own people from these serious crimes is no longer domestic affairs. You have responsibility if you are a state, but if you fail to meet that responsibility, then we will do that for you. Who are we? International community. There are cases, dozens of cases where R2P has been cited, both in Security Council resolution and General Assembly resolution. The third new concept is humanitarian intervention. This is not yet fully established and is sometimes quite controversial. What does it mean? Actions undertaken by an organization or organizations, usually a state, that are intended to alleviate extensive human suffering within the borders of a sovereign state. Such suffering tends to be the result of a government instigating, facilitating, or ignoring the abuse of groups falling within its jurisdiction. This abuse often takes the form of deliberate and systematic violations of human rights, including forced expulsions, ethnic cleansing, and in the most extreme cases, genocide. So what does it mean? If these things happen, and if there is humanitarian crisis, then other countries can intervene. Not even the international community. Other countries should intervene because it's humanitarian crisis. It goes like for example, the first humanitarian movement, which was called Red Cross. When Henri Dunant, the Swiss businessman, came up with this idea of Red Cross movement, it was like he went to the battlefield in the 19th century, and when soldiers are shot down and bleeding on the ground, the others are busy fighting, and there should be someone who helps the fallen soldiers before he dies, right? So that's humanitarian need. So these people with Red Cross mark and goes to the battlefield and take out the fallen soldiers, they don't ask the soldiers, where he is from. When he's bleeding, you ask them, are you German or Swiss or French? And if he says, I'm German, then you move to another person. You don't do that. You don't ask, You just take the fallen soldiers out so that you can give them help, right? That's humanitarian action. The same concept is applied here. So when there is humanitarian crisis, don't think about non-intervention policy or anything. You just get in there and help people who are dying. But this is, of course, more controversial than Red Cross. Humanitarian intervention constitutes a calculated and uninvited breach of sovereignty in the name of humanity. That's true. In the name of humanity, they know that they are breaching state sovereignty. They are infringing on state sovereignty. But is state sovereignty such a holy concept that can never be infringed on? I don't think so. The concept of state sovereignty, which came into being in the 17th century Westphalia Treaty, was a creation of European countries, because that time they were fighting between states too often, and they thought, especially small states, let's just recognize them, all of them, including small ones, have same sovereignty. So let's just leave them alone, It came like that in the beginning, I'm oversimplifying it, but so I don't know if a principle of state sovereignty is, something that you cannot touch, I think it's time for us to give more thoughts about it. Anyway, though humanitarian interventions do not necessarily require the employment of military force, as they could include, for example, the imposition of sanctions, the term refers normally to situations in which force is used. So the European countries bombed former Yugoslavia, citing the need for humanitarian intervention some 20 years ago. And after that, there have been cases of humanitarian intervention. When the Americans bombed Syria, when the Syrian government used chemical weapons, they also cited need for humanitarian intervention. This government is using chemical weapons against its own people. We should intervene. And we cannot take action in the Security Council because some permanent member is blocking decision. So we need to intervene. That was the logic of humanitarian intervention in Syria. If you believe that, yes, we should intervene, I totally support concept of humanitarian intervention, so be it. If you believe, no, states are sovereign. If you go about intervening like that, then they will use it politically. They will say, these powerful countries will always say that, well, I don't like this, so let's call it humanitarian intervention and invade. So things will get messier. So I don't like the concept of humanitarian intervention, so be it. So you can either support this concept or oppose this concept. That's why the concept is still controversial. It's not like R2P or ICC. ICC and R2P are already international law. It is institution. R2P is a concept endorsed by all countries in the world through a UN resolution. Humanitarian intervention is not. Finally, I like to cite two efforts by the United Nations to promote and protect human rights. The first effort is to protect human rights of vulnerable people. This part of human rights activities have not much to do with democracy. So even if you don't have democracy, you can still protect rights of vulnerable people. Who are vulnerable people? Sometimes women are also vulnerable because women have been discriminated in many societies. Children, persons with disabilities, migrant workers. So if you have a democracy, rights of these people probably would be better protected. But even if you don't have democracy, even if you don't have political freedom, you can still protect rights of these vulnerable people. So there are 9 conventions in the world, and except the first 2 conventions, covenants, which are part of International Bill of Rights, as I explained. No, I mean number 2 and 3, which are covenants, part of International Bill of Rights, or other human rights conventions, or 7 human rights conventions in the UN are about protecting rights of vulnerable groups, persons with disabilities, migrant workers, children, women, those who are tortured, racial minorities. I'm going to skip the disability part, and I will go to the North Korean human rights. But actually, in a separate recorded lecture, I will talk more about North Korean human rights. So in this class, I will just say a few concluding words and take questions if you have questions. North Korean human rights issue was first introduced by NGOs like Amnesty International until 1990s, because not too many people knew what was happening inside North Korea. But by mid-1990s, there were defectors coming out of North Korea, and they testified that there were prisoners' camps in North Korea. There were tortures in North Korea. There were public executions in North Korea. So international community realized that there were human rights violations in North Korea. So from 2003, Human Rights Council started to adopt resolutions on North Korean human rights. General Assembly started to adopt resolutions in 2005. So during the last 15 years, the North Korean human rights issue has been on the agenda of the United Nations. But in 2014, the document this gentleman is holding, this gentleman named Michael Kirby, former Supreme Court Justice of Australia, he headed a commission of inquiry on North Korean human rights, and they came up with 400-page report which concluded that the human rights violations in North Korea constituted crimes against humanity. And they recommended the Security Council to refer the case to International Criminal Court. The Security Council discussed that issue for the first time in history in December 2014. And that's me speaking there. They adopted this issue on Security Council agenda, but they were not able to refer it to International Criminal Court because for doing that, you need agreement of all permanent members of the Security Council. But they were able to put it on the agenda of the Security Council because you just need 9 votes. There is no veto power for adoption of an agenda. So that's how this issue is now on the agenda of Security Council, which is very unusual. As I told you, human rights are dealt with by General Assembly and Human Rights Council, not by the Security Council. But Security Council deals with a human rights issue when it becomes so serious that it might pose threat to peace, and there have been only 3 such cases in history, including the DPRK. So after that, Security Council continued to discuss North Korean human rights issue in the Council every December. And what is an issue related to is that we are still providing humanitarian assistance to North Korea. You know, even under international sanctions, you can still provide humanitarian assistance. And I think we should participate in humanitarian assistance to North Korea. But as you can see here, South Korea was providing a good amount of assistance through the UN, but in 2016 and 2017, we stopped because of international sanctions. Actually, we can still do that under international sanctions, but we stopped. And in the meantime, the efforts continue to restore trust and national identity between the 2 Koreas. Thank you very much.